Welcome, everybody, to another night of Consciousness Cafe. I'd like to start by just letting everybody know what we're all about. Consciousness Cafe is a place you can come to, visit our website, to hear about people's experiences, typically metaphysical experiences. We feel that giving people an opportunity to hear other people's stories might help people feel more affirmed in their own experiences. So this is a safe place you can come to and talk about whatever you want to talk about. I'm hoping that this summer, when I get back from knee surgery, that at least in Greensboro, we can have an in-person gathering like we used to do before COVID. For now, we're doing things via Zoom. So welcome tonight. I'm going to be talking about a subject that I've had some exposure to quite regularly called after-death communications. And after-death communication, I think, starting with a definition of it, it's some form of communication. It's not necessarily auditory or visual. It could be a smell or an animal that repeatedly shows up and behaves in unnatural ways. But it's basically a communication from a deceased loved one or friend that somehow you perceive. And this happens with some degree of regularity. This isn't mediated by a psychic or a medium. It just shows up unexpected. Can be very uplifting. It can be a little frightening if you've never experienced anything like this before. In my journey, I've run into a number of people who've had after-death communications. I personally haven't had one, but the frequency of people sharing stories with me leads me to believe that these are probably happening with some degree of regularity, and maybe more frequently than we realize. People are just afraid to talk about them because our society generally kind of frowns upon this type of experience. People might think that it's made up. It's just my mind wanting to believe something. But if you realize that people are having these experiences and are willing to talk about them, then it moves beyond the realm of just wondering, is this real, to celebrating the fact that it is real. That perhaps the communication division between this physical reality we occupy and the non-physical that we move into after we pass, the division between those two is not as impenetrable as most people might think it is. So later on, I'm going to give people a chance, if you've had an experience of your own, I'd love to hear about it. What I'd like to do is I'll make a presentation for a while. Then we're going to give folks an opportunity to raise your hand if you want to talk. If you have questions that you'd like to pose, if you don't want to talk, you can put a question in the chat if you know how to use that. If you don't know how to raise your hand, if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a button that says reactions. I think that's where you would raise your hand. Leslie will help me out and call on people to participate in the discussion end of this. So let me get started. My first exposure to an after-death communication was probably the early 1980s. Some of you may have heard this story before. As a young man, in my childhood, my boyhood days, our family went to a YMCA camp in the Adirondacks of New York State. Every week, or 1 week every year, there was a family camp, and the same families would come back year after year. There's one family in particular, the Schutz, had 3 beautiful daughters, and depending on how old you were, if you were a boy, you had a crush on one of these daughters. So I have this fond memory of the Schutz family, and whenever we'd go up there, I was always wondering, are they going to show up again? Are those girls going to be here? So fast forward to many years, we stopped going in my late teens. Other things took precedence. But I got married and had my first son. Second one was on the way. I wanted to share this family camp experience with my wife. So I asked her if she'd be willing to go up there for that week, and she agreed. This was probably 2 years or so after the death of my brother, Alan. Alan had fought cancer for most of his life, finally succumbing to it at the age of 29. So we go up to family camp, and interestingly, a lot of the people from my parents' generation were still attending. Their kids weren't there, but they were attending. And among those people were the Shoots. Now, I heard while I was up there that one of the Shoot daughters had died. And knowing the impact that had on my parents when my brother died, I thought maybe it'd be appropriate for me to, if an opportunity arose, to talk to the Shoots about the loss of their daughter. So one evening after dinner, the dining hall had this long porch. You could sit on chairs and look down over the camp from the porch of the mess hall. Mr. Shoot was sitting by himself. So I pulled a chair up and started a conversation with him. And I said, I understand your daughter died. Would you tell me something about that? And he explained that his daughter had moved to California. She had a painting business. And I don't know whether it was like house painting or artistic painting. I just remember it was a painting business. She had been hiking on a trail in California and had a brain aneurysm and died on that trail. And I expressed my condolences to Mr. Shoot. I informed him that I had lost a brother, and I had seen the kind of impact that can have, losing a child, the impact it has on parents. Mr. Shoot made a comment to me that kind of caught me off guard. He said, Jim, something happened to me that has made it easier for me to accept the loss of my daughter. The night after she died, he lived in Rochester, New York. I woke up in the middle of the night to this overpowering odor of paint. They weren't painting anything in the house. Mr. Shoot got out of bed, walked around the house, could find no source for this odor, went back to bed, fell asleep, and the next morning that odor had completely dissipated. There was no paint odor anymore. And he said in his mind that was his daughter's way of reaching out to him to let him know that he was okay. Well, I hadn't begun my investigation of metaphysical things, so it was a little strange, but I knew Mr. Shoot, and there's no reason for him to be telling me something like that if it wasn't his first-person experience. Now we'll go forward another few years. I've worked for my last 17 years in a company that created and managed anesthesia practices. One of the owners of the business and I were friends, although he didn't know about my interest in metaphysical things. We were coming back from a hospital in Danville, Virginia, where we had a contract. And on the way back, I posed a question to Larry. I said, Larry, have you ever known anybody that's had a near-death experience? And he looked at me with kind of a strange look. And he said, well, why are you asking me that, Jim? And I said, well, I think I've been studying this subject for a while, and I know you've been working in operating rooms for most of your working life. I thought maybe you would have come across somebody that had a near-death experience. Well, Larry's face kind of softened, and because we were friends, he said, I've never known anybody that's had a near-death experience, but something happened to me recently. I said, well, tell me about it. And he said, do you remember I had a brother-in-law who died of cancer about 4 months ago? I said, yeah, I remember that. He said, well, about a month after he passed, I was on an airplane. We were taxiing out the runway, and I heard my brother-in-law's voice say to me, Larry, it's Bill. I'm fine. Larry said it was so shocking, it made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He looked around. He couldn't see any place where this could possibly be coming from. Nobody else seemed to have heard this. but he knew it was his brother-in-law's voice, and he wrestled with, what do I do with this? Do I go back to my sister-in-law or my sister and tell her about this message I got from her husband? She was still grieving the loss of her husband. If I do that, will I be thought of as being a little crazy? So he decided to keep it to himself, and I was the first person that he shared this with. And I told him, this is not something that never happens. This is something that happens from time to time. Um, so there's another instance that I was going to share with you this evening. I've gotten multiple. It seems like maybe once a quarter I run into somebody that's had one of these experiences. Um, I don't know what it is. I guess in the course of a conversation, I get a sense for whether somebody's open to a subject of metaphysical nature, and I pose a question. Have you ever known anybody that's heard from somebody that's deceased? And that's when opportunities arise for people to share their stories. Another story I'll share with you. I was out in California visiting my son and his family. Um, my youngest grandson out there is now 6 years old. It was probably 2 years ago when he was 4. Every day we had a special thing we did. I'd take him out to a local playground, and he would just run around climbing all the equipment there, and I'd sit on the side and just kind of keep an eye on him. This one morning we went out. We were the only ones who showed up initially. So he's still out running around, playing around, but about 20 minutes after we're there, a woman comes in with what appears to be her granddaughter. And granddaughter's probably about the same age as my grandson. She sits down about 20 feet away from me, and I wave to her and start a little conversation. And I said, "Is this your granddaughter?" And she said, "Yes." And other little things. Is this your family lives here? Yes, they do. Are you from this area? No, I'm visiting. I said, so this is your son's family? And she said, yes, but my son died in Afghanistan. He was in the military and lost his life over there. So again, knowing a little bit about the impact that can have on somebody's life, people don't tire of talking about their lost child. So I got up and went over to her and sat down with her. I said, tell me about your son. And she began telling me about him and his life and what he was doing in Afghanistan and how long ago it was that he was killed. And at some point, enough of a rapport had been established that I asked her, have you ever felt as if your son has attempted to reach out to you? And the smile came to her face. And she said, well, yes. The week after he died, every day I'd come out my front door and there would be a blue jay sitting on the front steps. And it wouldn't fly away when I came out. It was looking at me. And as I walked by, it watched me walk by. And I just felt certain that this was my son reaching out to me, letting me know that he was okay. It was a good conversation. I at that time I built up enough knowledge of things. I said, don't let anybody tell you that this is just something you made up in your mind. This is an experience that a lot of people have. There's a book you should consider reading. It's called Hello from Heaven. Now, if this subject is of interest to you, I'd strongly recommend reading the book. Again, it's Hello from Heaven. It's a husband and wife team that over the years have accumulated, I think, over 3,000 cases of people who've had after-death communications. And they wrote this book and share maybe over 200 of those experiences that were shared with them. So when I told her about this and I was affirming of her experience as being real, I could tell that this was resonating with her. Eventually, I had to get up and go. It was time to take my grandson back home. So I stood up, gave her a hug, and she pulled a rubber wristband, if you can see it, if you're watching me. And she gave it to me and said, "Thank you for listening to me. I want you to have this." And this rubber wristband is inscribed. It says, "Never forgotten, Corporal Jared C. Verbeek." And on the inside, it says, I have a hard time remembering, Afghanistan, the city in Afghanistan, and the date that he was killed. So to give me this, that it tells me that this meant something to her, to have somebody willing to listen to her. So I encourage people, if you're ever in a situation where you're helping somebody who's grieving the loss of a loved one, particularly a child, this may be a subject that would be worth exploring. I wouldn't suggest just jumping out and posing the question. You got to take a moment, take some time to see if you think this person might be open to something like that. But the frequency of this happening, I've probably met 15 or 20 people in the last few years that have had some kind of experience. I'd like to share one of this, if I can find it. Let's see. Here it is. I'll share my screen, but I'm going to read this in case you can't see it. This is one of the stories out of Hello from Heaven. Leland was our friend, and we bought our home from him. He was a mail carrier and was killed one morning in his mail truck. The next morning, he appeared in my bedroom. While standing there, he told me to tell Frances, his wife, that he had an insurance policy. She didn't make this, can't read it all. She had an insurance policy she didn't know about. He said, "It's in our bedroom, in the top drawer of the chest under the paper." Now remember, he's telling this friend this. "Tell Frances where it is." And then he disappeared. My husband Cliff walked in the room, and I told him what had happened. He said, "Well, let's call and tell Frances." I said, "She'll think I'm nuts." So my husband went down and told Leland's brother, Reed, to look in the top drawer of the chest under the paper, that he might find an insurance policy there. But Cliff didn't explain what had happened to me. Sure enough, they looked, and there was an insurance policy, just like Leland had told me. Reed called and thanked my husband, but we never told them how we knew. They just wouldn't have understood. Let me go back to So this book is filled with stories like that, and I find them fascinating. This one in particular, because it had an element to it that seemed to verify the authenticity of this. This wasn't, there's no reason why this couple would have any idea that there was an insurance policy in this chest drawer. And to find that there was one there seems to offer some validation that information was passed that was useful, and seems to indicate that these experiences are not just an illusion made up in our minds. I had a recent conversation with a woman. This is probably going on a week ago. I went into an insurance office to pay a car insurance bill. And somehow we got on the subject, the woman's agency, I was in her office, and I can't remember how we got on the subject, but after death communications came up, and she said, well, she'd had such a thing. I said, well, tell me about it. And she said, my daughter was off at college and was in a very close relationship with a young man. This young man, I can't remember the specifics, but something happened at that college, and his parents weren't pleased with something he had done, and they decided to pull their funding for him at this college and said, if you want to go to school, you're going to have to come home and we'll pay for a community college education. Well, This young man, I mean, that's a pretty serious thing to have to admit that you failed at something that was your fault. Um, he was in this very close relationship with this woman, and that meant that he was going to have to leave her. So his whole life was being upended by what his parents decided to do as a result of whatever the issue was. This young man apparently had some mental health issues as well. He ended up committing suicide. The night after he committed suicide, the mother of the daughter who was in the relationship, this insurance agent, woke up in the middle of the night, and this young man's form was at the foot of her bed. And he apologized to her for what he had done and said, please tell others that I'm so sorry for taking my life. So I'm sure this is not a story that that insurance agent would readily share with someone because of the way we judge things. But in any event, there it is. So I think that these experiences are to be treasured. Let's talk a little bit about a new emerging psychotherapy called induced after-death communications. This is a non-traditional form of therapy. It uses something called EMDR, eye movement desensitization, and forgot what the R stands for. But they use this eye movement therapy along with tapping on the hands of people who are experiencing deep grief. And they find that they can induce, for some people, here's a Lina, thank you, Lina. R stands for reframing. They can induce an after-death communication, according to this one organization, up to 75% of the time. I watched a movie on this subject. Maybe some of you saw it. I can't remember the name of it, but it came out maybe 4 or 6 months ago, and it focused on one woman who had lost her, I believe it was her husband, and had not been particularly open to this concept, but her daughters were very focused to help their mother find a way to deal with the grief of the loss of her husband and to get on with her life. So it was this movie went through the process, and at some point, there was an image of her sitting with a therapist, reprocessing, not reframing. Sorry. And she had an after-death communication. Now you don't hear it. The therapist wouldn't hear it or wouldn't be a participant in it. It arises within at least that particular patient, and it seemed to help her. If the sense of loss, I guess, gets diminished if you can have this kind of communication. Then perhaps you can feel like this is not the end, that maybe someday you'll be reunited with this loved one. I recall another friend who had an experience. His name is Lloyd Auerbach. Barb has got I'm so thank you, everybody. Living with Ghosts is the name of the film. You can see, you can find that on the internet. So I was going to tell you about Lloyd Auerbach and his experience. Lloyd and I met through the Rhine Center. Lloyd is somewhat has a bit of a reputation for being a ghost hunter, and he's a very analytical guy. He's not someone who has wild theories, but he's pretty objective in his work. So he talked about one of his experiences. There were 3 friends who hung out together. And apparently at some point, one of these friends died. Lloyd was in his car driving home, and all of a sudden this cigar odor arose in his car. The friend who had died had been a cigar smoker, and the odor of the cigar that he smoked was somewhat unique. Each cigar will have its own specific aroma to it because it's made up depending on the tobacco leaves it's made from. And in any event, Lloyd's driving in his car, and this odor arises, and a smile comes to his face. He said, "I knew it was my friend reaching out to me." And it was such a wonderful experience to have this odor arise. As soon as he got home, he wanted to call this other friend and tell him about this experience. So he dials him on the phone, and before Lloyd gets a chance to explain his experience, his friend says, wait a minute, you won't believe this. At 10 o'clock in the morning, just a little while ago, uh, this cigar odor arose. It was our friend's cigar smoke. And, I just knew it was him. So here you have kind of a simultaneous after-death communication in two different locations. Uh, it's a fascinating notion that people find ways of reaching back to communicate. Don't really know their purpose all the time, although the insurance agent, I think the boy who committed suicide, felt regret at that and was reaching out for a purpose to try to let these people know that he was sorry for what he had done. So I could go on with more stories, but let's open it up here a bit. Does anybody maybe have your own story that you'd like to share? Or if you've got some questions, you can raise your hand. Be happy to involve people and hear whatever you have to say. Daniel, Leslie, are you ready to?
I certainly am.
Okay.
So I have a story from today, actually. Some of you, a few of you know that I do hypnosis and regression therapy. And I had a regression session today with an older woman, about mid-70s. And she was kind of disturbed by a variety of things, not no more than most of us, but one thing in particular had happened, and it was that her older sister had passed away. And so one of the questions she had on her list of questions for the experience was, what happened there, and she wanted to connect with other past loved ones. Pretty much all of her family, her siblings and parents had passed away. And so we went through the experience, and towards the end, she returned to a certain sort of center point that we use. And then who should arrive but all of these relatives. And it's such an incredibly healing thing when we don't believe in the non-physical, to have an experience like that. And she's talking with them telepathically, of course, and they're wishing each other well and letting her know that they're fine, and that they're looking forward to seeing her soon. So that's my story for you, Jim.
So there are a lot of ways. Apparently, it's not just this EMDR. You can maybe through regression therapy, people can get opened up to connecting with these loved ones.
Yeah, it doesn't always happen. I want to make that clear, but yeah, thank you.
So, Jim, I believe Bill has his hand raised.
Okay.
Space. On.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to phrase the question.
Hand now lowered.
Once somebody, physically dies, and so you're sort of turned loose from all of the, I guess, the bondage of the physical body. Based on what, Jim, based on what you've read, or
Galaxy Tab
anybody else,
S6 has joined.
is there anything that helps direct people or spirits or whatever. So they all sort of behave the same way. In other words, if somebody wants to go out and do something that's really not customary, and is there a group that says, no, we don't do it this way, this is, you need to kind of, there are ways to approach people that you've left behind, and there are ways not to, and there is sort of an understood code of conduct type of thing? Or does it, is there anybody to sort of help you? It's like being a new kid in school and you don't know what the rules are. And is there any way that that's communicated, or do you just sort of figure it out?
I
By doing the wrong thing.
I suspect that there are a lot of different ways that each of us, there may be a spectrum of how open we are to this type of communication. And the most optimal way to reach out, and you have to ask the question, for example, on the insurance agent, the mother, why did this young man come to the mother and not to the daughter? Or not, why was that set up that way? Now, it may be that the mother
Samsung SM-S918U has joined the meeting.
I don't know what that is, but in any event, if some people are more open to it, why would my friend Larry get the communication from his brother-in-law when it was his wife that most needed that? So I suspect that there's like a continuum of openness to this type of thing happening. Now, from the other side's perspective, I think it's probably, I don't know if there's a code of conduct. I think they're just people on the other side, consciousness on the other side has a desire to reach out, and they somehow find a way to do that. I'll give you another example. I have a friend, Rebecca, is it Clausel Austin or Austin Clausel? I can't remember which comes first. She wrote a book about her experience. She lost her brother, and she had her communication, or she's had multiple communications, but her first communication came when she was riding a horse. She she owns a horse and rides it pretty regularly. And she found that it was very therapeutic for her to go out and ride this horse after the loss of this. Her brother was really something
Currently
special.
unmuted. Alt+A button.
In her book, she talks about how going out with this horse and getting into a meadow somewhere and stopping, that's when her brother will reach out to her. And this happens over and over again. Now, little side thing here, because I know Becky, I had an interest, I'm a bit of a scientist in my leanings. And I said, I'd like to try something. I'd like to try a communication to see if I could give you a word, you pass it to your brother, and your brother pass it to somebody else that's not known by Becky. And let's see if we can set up this communication ring. It'd be a nice, if you understand what I'm saying, it'd be a nice way to do a blinded test to see if there was a way to pass information from the physical to the non-physical and back to the physical. She said, well, I'll ask him and see what he says. And she ran out on her horse and had the conversation, and he said, why would I want to do that? So his priorities, he didn't have an interest in the worldly objective I had. So it's hard. We have to be careful about applying things that we think are important to us in our human lives and assume that those priorities that we have.
Audio now unmuted.
So it's I don't have a good answer for you, Bill, other than I think there's a continuum of openness.
Space.
Yeah, Jim, one quick
Mute
question.
currently
Remember
unmuted. Alt
remember the
plus A
game
button.
Gossip that we used to play? If you've done that and the new person, the unknown
The
person,
host muted you. You are muted. Press Alt plus A to unmute your
Yeah,
microphone
weird.
or press and
Is that coming from you, Bill?
space. Mute
Yeah.
currently unmuted.
somebody okay, if you remember the game Gossip that we used to play, and
Yep.
you'd start at one end of a group and whisper something real
Audio
fast,
now unmuted.
and then you'd kind of see what they did at the other end. If this unknown person that you brought, or unknown spirit you brought in, had responded, but the word or phrase that he came back with was so far removed from what you started with, you wonder if maybe there's a gap in. I mean, it's just kind of interesting to see if that is also possible.
Mhm.
I mean, it's who knows.
Yep. All right, let's move on.
Yeah, so
Bill.
Janine has her hand raised next.
Hi, I've had communication with deceased people that I loved for most of my life. The first time when my grandpa died, I was 15, and I woke up in the middle of the night and he was standing at the foot of my bed. But he lived in Michigan and I was in California, and he had come to say goodbye. And that morning when I got up, after I went back to sleep, and when I got up that morning, my mom was crying and told me that grandpa died. And I said, I know, he told me, and kind of freaked her out. But there's been others, and my mom and she's been out of her body for over 5 years now. And I've had communication with her and a friend that died in the 90s. But 3 years ago, my husband died suddenly and unexpectedly the same day that WHO declared COVID a worldwide pandemic. And 3 weeks later, we had already been planning to sell our house. The kids were grown. And I was fretting about the fact that all of our memories were in that house. And I heard him clear as day say, I will be with you no matter where you go. And so that was, and since that time, I've often heard him, but to the point someone else was asking, and to the point you've made about receptivity, I think I've been very receptive because from a young age, I've known that this is possible. And I know others that have had communication. But if you're closed off on a particular topic, you can't, it's like, it's not that they can't get to you, it's that you can't perceive them if you don't believe in that. And one of the things that happened to me, my husband would never, both his parents lived to his mid-90s. So him dying when he did was, his dad had only been gone 8 years, was shocking and unexpected. And he never talked about what he wanted if something were to happen to him. He wouldn't talk about that. So I didn't know. We were out of state on vacation actually when he passed. So I had him cremated, but he was University of Michigan's like biggest fan. So I kept thinking that his urn should be University of Michigan, but I didn't really want a University of Michigan urn on my mantle because that wasn't my thing. It was his thing. And it just made me sad. And it just wasn't what I wanted. And I was really struggling with that decision. Well, a friend of mine who is a medium, she's a friend, she's not somebody I've ever paid for any sort of work in that line, called me out of the blue and she said, Phil is trying to get a message to you. And I was like, well, that's interesting because he's talking to me. So I don't know what. And she said, he wants you to know he's flying with the eagles. Well, I had in my card on a website the urn I wanted to put him in, which was a mountain scene with an eagle flying over the mountains. And him flying with the eagles was something that he had said. But this friend of mine had never met him. She was my friend, but not his friend. There's no way she could have known that. But because I was struggling with what to do, it felt like this big, heavy decision to me. And like I was being selfish, wanting what I wanted instead of what I thought he'd want. I couldn't hear him on that topic. So that's pretty much what I wanted to share about my experiences. I have a lot more. I'm in widows groups and in on Facebook, and on those groups, a lot of people talk about getting communication. And sometimes it's them doing like leaving something on the pillow that there was no way it got there. Sometimes it's flashing the lights when they shouldn't be flashing and things like that. I actually hear my late husband talking, but there's different types, and I can also just feel the energy. Really, anytime I talk about him, I can feel his energy. Same thing with my mom and my friend.
So
Jim, I'm sorry, Jim.
an interesting point there. Maybe, as I said to begin with, the ways that the people on the other side reach out to us can be odors, they can be animals. You just raised another way, Janine. That's physical things, making like a dime or a penny showing up repeatedly in a place that it never was before. So then maybe that tends to say that on the other side, maybe there are different, the ability to communicate with one particular consciousness might be more readily through one particular method. You know, we probably would like to have a visual and communication, but that might not be how they're able to come through.
So Jim, Bhavna shares with us that she's learned from mediums that when one is grieving, it's difficult for past relatives to connect because it takes a lot of energy.
Mm-hmm.
So connecting with a less grieving relative or friend is easier in those cases. So
That's
it
great.
sounds like it's a matter of openness and receptivity.
That's a helpful insight. I appreciate that comment.
Daniel?
I remembered my own experience of this sort, which relates a little bit to what was said already. But first, I want to give some advice to Bill. Bill, I'm aware that you are visually impaired and that you use a screen reader. And that's that voice that you keep hearing, Jim, when you say, I'm not sure what that is.
Okay.
Bill, if you use headphones, you'll be the only one who hears that. And you'll still hear us as well. So I recommend headphones. Now, to my point, my wife's mother, my mother-in-law, passed away. She was only like 56. And she, my parents had passed away like, 40 years before that. Okay, when I was a youngster, young teen. And I'd never had a communication that I can say from my parents or anything. But after my mother-in-law passed away, we had some inheritance, and I had been on the verge of starting a business. But I was feeling uneasy about using the inheritance to help start that business. And so I just kind of kept that to myself. And one night in a dream, she came to me and she said just one thing. She said, "It's okay." Now, this is my wife's mother. And so I was like, okay. And we did start that business, and it was extremely successful. So that's my little story about that. Thank you.
That's great.
Thank you, Daniel. Sheila?
You got to unmute yourself, Sheila.
Okay, better now. I have several stories, but I'd like to relate one that I think it was really interesting to me, and kind of brings home the point that, as you were saying before, there are many ways to communicate. Sometimes it's hard because we're just not communicating the right way. I was reading, for those of you who don't know, I'm a medium and an Akashic Records reader. And I was reading a friend of mine, and I didn't really know much about her family, but we were in the middle of an Akashic read, and she was asking questions about family and connections, etc. So we covered most of her family, and she had 2 sons, and we had covered her first son. The second son was on the stage, so to speak, and we were trying to get ask questions and get answers from him. And I didn't know anything about him really, but I could see him. I knew what he looked like. I described him, his physical features, and she said, "Yes, that's my second son." And I saw his earthly body. It was very outgoing. He was personality plus. He was intelligent. He was just everything, personable that you could imagine. But I knew that wasn't his energy because he was miserable. So I said to her, I had looked up in my left upper visual frame, and I could see his energy spinning around in a circle. And I said to her, I said, "Has this son transitioned or is he still with us?" And she said, "He transitioned a number of years ago." And I said, "Well, he's still here." His energy was still here. He had never transitioned over to the other side. And sometimes that happens. When that happens, generally, the energy is very discontent because there's really nothing to do. There's no direction. They don't know what to do with themselves. And I said, he's miserable because he thought it would be the best for you. They were very close. She missed him terribly, but it wasn't. And so we sat for a while and talked with him and said, if you go ahead and transition, you will be able to communicate with your mother because that's kind of the way it works. So I told her to not be afraid to talk to him and encourage him to transition, and then they could communicate more clearly in the future. So fast forward about 8 months to a year later, I read her again, and he came through. And he was talking about some of their experiences, and then he said he was very emotional when he came through, and I can feel that. But he said, "Mom, is there, there's a place out in the backyard?" I had to ask her if this was true. He said, "It's a stump, big stump." She said, "Yes, there is a big stump in our backyard, and we gather around it." And he said, "That's where I will be, Mom. If you go out there and sit, you can talk to me and we can have our conversations." So it's such a relief, for people when they hear from loved ones because they just want to know they're okay and they just want to be able to communicate. But sometimes there are those caveats that keep you from having clear communication. And I was so grateful that we could come to that point where they could communicate with one another. So I was grateful to be able to help her.
Thank you, Sheila. That may be a good subject for another gathering, this notion of people needing assistance to make their transition. So thanks for that. And we'll talk about that with the Consciousness Cafe group.
Bruce?
So I've had communications from people who have passed on for many years, and I don't know when it's, unlike Janine, I don't know when it started. Mostly there are people who I am close to, in my family, for instance, but not exclusively. I don't really know what more to say than that. None of the experiences are physical, no physical manifestations, very little visual manifestation or none at all. It's kind of like I know what they're thinking or know what the communication is. I don't like the word telepathy, but I don't have another one.
Bruce, I have a question for you. When you get these communications, does it seem to arise at any particular point in your head? Or is it just kind of a generic knowing?
No, it's more in my heart than my head.
Okay.
And it flows, I would say it flows out from my heart to my head in most cases. Now, there's exceptions, of course, where it can appear as a thought that comes from not myself, but from some person or being who's not incarnated.
Yeah.
And it really depends on the person also. So my uncle passed relatively recently, and he lived in South Carolina. I'm in North Carolina. He was a very interesting person, and I won't tell his life story here, but just say, I think every kid that grew up around him was a little afraid of him, not because he was ever mean, he was never mean, but because he was kind of focused, and it wasn't focused on the kids. He had a very important job and so on. And then he retired because the job was so important, it made him a lot of money, and he retired early. And in that retirement, he changed a lot, especially right near the end. And it has to do with his grandchildren and things, but again, I won't go into details. But he became very much warmer and very much focused on the grandchildren, who were now adults at the time that he passed, and on their children.
He had a conversation
with his
relationship.
Something on one on his side of the family. I think it wasn't his aunt, it probably was his cousin, who I've met but never knew, right near the end. And he was talking, and it was related to me after he passed. And the conversation was about, he really hoped that his kids and the grandkids would really come to understand Jesus or Christ, because he felt this tremendous warmth from his belief. And so after he passed, it's the closest I can say appeared to me. And he has continually remained with me in a certain way. And I can't put into words what he is, because he's not saying things in words, but he is continually teaching me about the presence of Christ. And it's really, I'm just very grateful for it. I was scared of him when he was an adult and I was a kid. And it's really nice to have this other relationship. And I just really admire him for making that. I admire him and really look up to him, because he was able to make that transition from a person who was quite austere to a person who was really warm and caring. And I'm just sorry other people didn't get to know him at the end of his life.
Yeah.
He was very isolated because of COVID.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a blessing when you are able to connect with people like that. You know, it gives you a different perspective on life when you know that that death isn't an end; it's just a transition to something else. And you get affirmation. You know, for those of you on this call, it sounds like many of you have had experiences, and so you've had this personal affirmation that I'm guessing makes it a lot easier if you think about your own death. It's not a frightening thing. So thank you, Bruce.
Nam?
Hi, thank you very much. I'm new, so thank you so much for this topic. I guess I'll frame what I'm going to ask and say is there's definitely affirmation. So I would like to share a story that is very affirming for me, that the spirit and life continues afterwards, and share the example. And then I do have two questions. So the story has to do with something that happened 2 weeks ago. I've got two children. I'm a single mom, and I've got a 22-year-old who went off to Puerto Rico for spring break and had a blast, but got into a bit of an accident and had his jaw knocked and a tooth knocked out through no fault of his own. That same day, so of course I had to deal with dentists and so forth and so on in Puerto Rico. That same day, once that was done, it was a Friday, I got the dentist, who's somebody who spoke English. I get another call from my daughter's school, who's a high school senior, saying, called an ambulance. You got to get down here. She fell off the stage into the orchestra pit, 6 feet onto concrete, knocked her tooth out. So both kids, same day, tooth knocked out. One in Puerto Rico and one here in Maryland. So mom to the rescue. Long story short, got the kids, got one of them back the next day on the flight, and the other one, came back from hospital. So Saturday, once they were all together, in that evening, I realized, oh, better go to Giant to actually get some puree, vegetables pureed, because they've got to eat baby food from here on forth, even though they're 20 and 17. Not very happy camper kids, but that's what moms do. And that was the only moment I had really to myself to think, because I was out of action mode and I kind of was crying a little bit because I was by myself and I was in Giant. And I said a prayer and I said, God, just, not sure why two things happened on the same day, bad things to good people kind of situation. But then I also always, my both parents have passed, and I was very close to my father. And before he passed, I always said, Dad, when I need you, you be there, you communicate with me. And I kept saying, Dad, what is up with this? And I'm worried, and there are orthodontic bills and so forth and so on. What is this all about? So as I'm checking out, and just to give you a little more context, in the Indian language, I'm Indian, grandpa is called Nana. And my father really, his background was when we lived in India and even back in the United States when we moved here, his business was in the tea business. He in India, he managed these tea estates where beautiful Darjeeling and all those other teas are grown. And when we came to the America, he was packaging tea for private label companies, McDonald's and so forth and so on. So anyways, I said to him over the course before he had passed, you figure out ways to communicate with me. And when I need him, I see things like tea, and I see, number that particularly means to him, or I'll see his name or the town we lived in. I'm checking out after this, trying to figure out baby food for my kids, upset, thinking about it. And at the end of the checkout for Giant, they have this special sort of buy one, get one free of Nana tea. I have never seen Nana tea before. I've seen Lipton tea. I've seen Tetley's tea. I don't know where the heck Nana tea. And if you go to Giant, you can hunt and find for it. You find Nana tea. It's Russian, for heaven's sakes. You just even see Russian products today. It's weird. And it's in Giant. So I say this story because I really knew it was him. And then as I drove out, I saw a license plate that said Jesus. So I was like, all right. And then I saw my thing clashed, and I saw another number. It was 111 or something like that. And I'm like, all right, there's lots of signs here. So that was really very encouraging. So I'm very happy. So that they are there, they're communicating in all kinds of ways. My question is twofold. One, how do I continue to encourage the conversation with my father and those who have passed that are protecting us and communicating messages? And I got the sense that obviously asking and being in the right frame of mind and the right energy level and spirit is a good thing. But is there other ways I can open myself up to more communication, because the signs are all around? So that's the first part of my question. And the second part of my question is, my father was a protector of all of us. So I really would love to find out because he's probably beyond space and time. Bad things happen to good people. These are his two grandkids. And the probability of both of them having accidents on the same day, and then these kind of coincidences happening after, is just, it's stunning. Same injuries, different locations, same day, both kids. And then this message from my father. So I guess I'm looking for little answers on what I can do differently, and then the why of. So I don't know if anybody has any insights of any of this.
Let me try addressing the second question, then I'd like to solicit feedback from others here on the first question. Why do bad things happen? In this case, well, let me start by saying judging something as being bad is a human judgment. From a spirit perspective, um, it's all experience. So we have to be careful about judging something as necessarily being bad. That doesn't diminish the impact it has on us as humans, but there could be purposes for things. So if we look at your experience, maybe these accidents had to happen in order for your father to put you in a frame of receptivity that would allow your father to come through. And you'd say, well, from a human perspective, well, that seems kind of odd. Why would my kids have to suffer in order for my father to come through to me? But that suffering is temporary, isn't it? I mean, I assume that everything's fine. They went through this, and maybe there's a broader message that your father wanted to impart, and that is that he's always there for you.
Yeah, could be. Mm-hmm.
So let me ask some others. In terms of go back to the first question.
Yeah, Jim, so Ron has something to say, and then I have a comment if you would like me to read it.
Great. Yes. Ron?
You're on mute, Ron?
Hi, Jim. I finally connected with you.
Good to see you, Ron.
And as far as answering just your last about why bad things do, the best awful thing happened in my life gave me a near-death experience and changed my life. But right now, what's happening a lot is 11/11. And I know that's saying something to me, but it's happening more. I look at the end of quarter of a football game, there'd be 11/11 left in the quarter. Driving down the road, you see the clock, there's 11/11. And I know that means something, but it's happened a lot.
So sometimes signs will show up and you don't know what they mean, or at least initially.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, Sheila, I believe you have something you'd like to contribute?
Yes, just from that last gentleman's comment about 11/11, they're angel numbers. There's a series of 4 ones there. So if you Google angel numbers, you'll find out what that means. And
Thank you.
you're welcome. And about being able to set up channels of communication with loved ones. Often the loved one who is coming through will have a signal and it'll be consistent over time. And then you will know they're in the room or they're in your presence. For example, I have a friend who comes through on the kitchen light and it'll blink and I know she's here. And it's just a feeling that you get. The other thing is I find it's sometimes beneficial for people who are going through problems and they have questions, that if those questions are lifted up, and then you just sit in silence and meditate, answers will come through and you will intuitively know who's bringing the answers. It might not be the same spirit all the time, but the answers will come through. And then there are various, like, everybody's been talking about signals. It's just that if you can actually communicate with a loved one and say, I want you to give me a consistent signal. And every time this happens in my house, I'll know it's you. And you can talk.
Interesting. That's great suggestion. Thank you for that, Sheila.
Mhm.
So Lina writes that she believes that Nana was protecting your children from experiencing something worse. And to hearken to the conversation that we're having, that it may be the way that he's communicating with you. So Lina, thank you for that contribution. Bill, let me poll. Nam, are you satisfied with the responses you've gotten?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Lana, for that, because as you said that, yeah, maybe there was something worse and that could have happened. Well, it could have happened. She could have cracked her neck. She could have done a lot more. So yes, so I absolutely. And I guess I will ask him more actively for being a protector, and as he was in real life, I will do that more actively. Absolutely. It's
Thank you,
heartening
Mel.
to know that they can do that. I guess that's the takeaway I take away from this then is it's heartening to know that they are watching and they can do this.
Yes. For sure.
All right. Bill, I believe you have your hand raised.
Yeah, by the way, to the new member, glad you are part of the group, and we welcome having you and stuff. In the biblical writings, some of the people who are real put off by some of this will tell you that you're not supposed to mess with I guess paranormal stuff. And my question is, I was reading one book that was actually written by a guy who was a yogi who was talking about what we thought was demonic possession. And in the story, there were two guys. Jesus had crossed over from one point on the Sea of Galilee to another when I forgot where it was. And he saw two men running around that were possessed by demons. And the explanation the author gave was that they had been messing around, I guess, on the astral level and had tapped into some kind of energy force that was a lot stronger than they were, but was also, in other words, he was bigger and meaner than they were, and he wouldn't turn them loose. And so they were, because they were used to acting on a lower level of, they couldn't get rid of him, or he wouldn't let them go. And Jesus actually broke that connection and sent the astral spirit back to wherever he originated from. But the question is, if you make yourself open to this kind of communication, has anybody seen is there a danger of the wrong spiritual forces tapping into that and I guess messing you up? Or is that pretty rare?
My sense is that it is rare, but it does happen. If you read books on out-of-body experiences, people who've done extensive travels out of body, there are vibration states that tend to attract people of very low vibration. I think I recall not too long ago a comment that Daniel made relative to this subject, that if you ever feel like you are in the presence of a negative energy, be the embodiment of love. Love is the most powerful force, and if you can offer love and just be love and ask for love, in these problems, that'll dissipate the negative situation you're in.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Daniel?
Thank you. Several of the subjects I want to address. 1111. This is in my opinion, it's communication from your guides, and what it means is up to you. For me, there's I think even a book out by this title called God Winks. It's just your guide or guardian, or those who support you, sort of tapping you on the shoulder saying, I got your back, I'm with you. It's just a wink, saying I'm with you. Whatever that may be. For some people it's finding a penny, for others it may be a dime or a feather, and you can find these things in unusual places, and that's the wink from your guardian. Regarding Nana, as Nam was sharing with us, one possibility, and there are many possibilities, and if you contemplate on them, the answer will probably come to you if you allow for it, if you allow for your intuition to know this. One possibility is that the one sibling tuned into the other sibling situation and had an empathetic reaction. And for whatever reason, because they're connected at a soul level, as we all are, it was like, boom, there it is. She wanted to have that same experience. Regarding Bill's question about negative energies, basically, Bill, fear is the main attractor of that stuff. So if you do things fearfully or without a spiritual foundation, and by spiritual, it doesn't have to be religious, it doesn't have to even include God, but by spiritual, I mean loving, kind, compassionate towards others. If you are that kind of person, those things generally will not affect you. And on top of that, if you are intentionally playing with dark forces, that's an invitation. It's like opening the door and saying, "Come on in, guys." You know, if you live in a bad, it's like going to a bad neighborhood and hanging there around with your wallet out and dollar bills flying out of your fingers. You're going to get mugged. That's what happens. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. Janine?
I think Daniel covered pretty much everything I was going to say. I think it is about vibration. And if you're loving, if you're kind, if you're in a state of love or appreciation, those energies are not going to come to you. And you're safe communicating with people who are not incarnate. If you are, I've known someone who was able to communicate with people that are incarnate, who was asked by law enforcement to help them with crimes, and she refused to do it because she would have to change her vibration to a much lower vibration in order to access the information they were wanting, and she just wasn't willing. And I don't blame her, because it can get you into a state where you're exposing yourself to things that you don't want in your consciousness, in your vibration.
Thank you, Janine. And before we move on, I'm going to make a comment from a shamanic perspective. When we're working with discarnate spirits that have not been able to transition, many times it's because they lack the energy to do it. And we have the energy, and so they're very much drawn to us. And I think of it like a drowning person. The drowning person does not intend to drown their savior, their helper, but out of fear, they do that. And sometimes what we're perceiving as malevolent or dark is really desperation, fear, and frustration from a spirit that's unable to communicate their circumstances to us. So I just wanted to offer that. Nam?
First of all, I want to say thank you to each one of you. Your advice and your insights are fascinating. So I'm very much grateful for that. Second, it's interesting what Daniel, you said. I had a choice in two explanations, and yours has resonated with me. The first one was a friend who came and said, somebody's put an evil eye, so both of your children had the accident. But Daniel, your interpretation of the two spirits coming in, one said, I want to experience it the same way. When they were little, my son said, "Oh yeah, I chose my sister when we were in the stars together." So I prefer to have the explanation which resonates on a higher love perspective, because those two souls came in together and chose me as the mom, versus so it's a higher loving frequency rather than the fear-based response, which I think is, oh, somebody put an evil eye on my two children. So I will walk away with the first example as to this was an act of love that the two children put together. And my dad chose this opportunity for me to share that he's still around. So I would prefer to think of it as a positive experience. Thank you.
Nam, have you ever heard of the concept of life between life?
Not so much, no.
There's a book, I don't know if it comes across, it's Journey of Souls.
Okay.
You might consider writing that down in terms of your children coming into this life, choosing to experience this life together. You might find that an interesting book to read.
Thank you. I will.
Well, I don't see any other hands raised. This has been a good evening.
Jim,
Yeah.
I had one question. Sorry, I was trying to get to the hand raised thing. Daniel or whoever wants to answer this, if you've got somebody who is who's a spirit that hasn't transitioned, and because they don't have the energy or the ability to do it, and they become involved with you, is there a way to, if you feel like they're pulling you down, is there a way to disconnect from that? I mean, I can imagine as a swimmer, because I've been swimming since I was like 6, but if somebody grabs hold of me and is not a swimmer, I mean, the first thing I would do is make sure that before I can help them, I've got to make sure that I don't drown with them. And so that's what I do first, is to make sure that I'm still, viable and stuff. Is there a way to disconnect from something like that? And is that also pretty rare?
Thanks for the question, Bill. Let me say that if a spirit is truly malevolent and intends bad things, love is the antidote. Love is like the garlic to the vampire, They don't want to be near it. They don't want to be around it. And if you're really kind and loving, you just have nothing to worry about. And when things happen, like Nam was relating to her kids, you take a positive interpretation. But if you take a negative interpretation and you say, oh my goodness, there could be bad spirits around, that's an invitation. That's changing your vibration from love and kindness to the other side. And then those spirits are like, oh, hey, somebody's opened the window. I can go rob that house,
Yeah, but it's not somebody,
Instead,
not somebody who's malevolent. It's just somebody who is
okay.
Is just weak and grabbing on to whatever's going to save them. Is that going to do the same
that's
thing?
not that they can't hurt you. You can help them, but they can't hurt you unless you are open to it and fearful in some way. So if there's something like that going on and you're getting poltergeist activity, like Sheila was saying, I think it was Sheila, I have a friend whose friend for quite a while, a couple of years after she passed away, was always blinking the lights in my other friend's house. And she's like, oh, that's just, Mary or whatever her name was. I don't remember. That's a positive interpretation. But if she got into a fearful state, that would be something else. Now, Mary was intentional, in my opinion, coming along and saying, hey, I'm still here. I'm still with you. I still love you. And I still think about you. And I know you're thinking about me, that kind of thing. If it's a spirit that's stuck, so to speak, or that hasn't passed over, it's usually because they don't know what's going on or they're afraid to go over, because and this is something religion does to us. We're taught as youngsters, through various religions, primarily through, say, the Christian religion, that if you're bad, you're going to hell, and God's going to judge you. And so when people have that built into them and they haven't really restructured those beliefs, they pass over and they're like, oh, wow, there really is an afterlife. And oh no, I did all these things in my life that I'm not proud of. And then they're just kind of like, well, I'm not, I'm going to hang out here instead of going to the other side and potentially being judged and potentially being sent to hell or purgatory or whatever it is. Little do they know that's not an issue. So.
And I would offer that, I'm sorry, I would offer that from a shamanic perspective, there are techniques that one can learn. The techniques are under the umbrella of psychopomp work, where the person works with their helping spirit and then goes into these realms to help these disincarnate individuals transition. So there are ways to do that that have been practiced for thousands of years. So if you're interested in that kind of work, I would invite you to look into shamanic work, specifically psychopomp. And having said that, it's not something you would enter into lightly. These are techniques, and you are working within realms that require experience and an understanding of what it is, but there are definitely techniques to help with that. So I am going to ask Lina, invite her to ask her question.
Well, it was more of just adding something to all the experiences everybody's had. And I've had quite a few. So the first one I had was when the person transitioned, who was my husband. I was crying and I was missing him when he had just left. And I heard him clearly say telepathically, "Stop crying, it's okay." And I thought, oh my goodness. And I stopped crying. And I knew that I talked to him again. I knew things were because we were really, really close. And I think he had a lot of paranormal stuff happen in his life. He didn't tell you about it, but I watched him and I could kind of tell when things were going on with him. So I knew we were going to have some communication after that. But a lot of times songs would come on the radio and they'd speak directly to me. I remember one of the first ones was a song that was done at our wedding. And whenever I heard that song, I knew that was him. And it's just, the lights would flicker. We shared an office and they would flicker off and on. And one time, one particular month, I don't even know what it was about, but anyway, for about a week, the telephone would ring. And you know how usually it's open and the operator comes on and tells you to get off or whatever. Well, the phone would stay on for 5 minutes. And I would tell, by that time it was kind of like a game. And I said, well, Bernard, you have to speak up because I can't hear you. And you could kind of hear like down a tunnel or something that something was going on. It wasn't a voice, but it was open. And I remember for about 4 or 5 days, it would happen between the time of 3:15 in the afternoon and 3:45, always that time. And then, let's see, the dog, his hunting dog, a Labrador, would stand and look at the wall, close to the wall, as if he was playing with him, like he used to give him treats or something. I mean, he was really close to the wall in the family room. And I knew he was seeing him then, because kids and dogs and the animals can see stuff. They don't qualify, they just know it, that's it. Yeah. And I would smell lavender after I get my kids off to school. I just kind of hang around, and in the bathroom was always a scent of lavender over my head. And I knew that was him trying to calm me down. And then let's see. Oh, one day at church, I walked under this tree going to my car, and I smelled this very strong fragrance of tribute cologne from Mary Kay, which is very strong, but it was for women. And the lady who wore that scent did not come to church that day. And I started laughing again. I said, okay, Bernard, you got it wrong. She's not here today. And then another time, it was like 6 or 7 months after he had passed. We hadn't been laughing or anything, but the kids used to come in our room on Saturday, they were small, and jump on the bed and we laugh and play. This particular day was the first time we ever laughed. And he was there. And there was a tribute cologne for men too, which is a lot stronger than the woman's, if you can believe it. And it was as if he took the bottle and turned it over. So I would not miss it. We would not miss it. I thought the kids smelled it, but they didn't. I was the only one who smelled it. And I started laughing. I said, okay, we know you're here. And then another thing too, the TV in our bedroom would scramble, just out of nowhere, just scramble, trying to get to another channel. And I thought, well, is there something going on with the radio station nearby or something that's messing with the TV? But it would always scramble to the sci-fi channel. And then I knew he was trying to get me to see something on there. Eventually, I found out that he was trying to get me to see John Edward. So I would see about the communication and everything. And that was kind of comforting too, because he was trying to get a message to me. And then books would fall off the shelf in the library, or if I went to the bookstore. And then I was in hospice support care after you pass. They were trying to help us. And I went one day past the book case, and this book fell off. And I knew it was for me. It was by Daniel Brinkley. What is it? Close. I can't remember what it was now. Changed by the Light or something like that. Anyway, and if anybody knows Daniel, he was funny too, but that was a good book for me. And then let's see, what else was it? Oh, Morse code. He was using Morse code with me one day. I was driving my son's truck, and on the way home from this meeting I had to turn the lights on. I don't know Morse code, but I know it's supposed to be dot dash, that kind of thing, that kind of rhythm. And I knew that's what he was saying, but he took it to the hilt. I knew he was trying to tell me. And I guess he figured since I could follow him with other things, I could probably do that too. But I didn't know Morse code. And then I was talking to my son one day while he was away at college, and he was on the computer, and he had to leave to go to class. But the computer, something changed. The font changed on the computer, and somebody was saying hi. And he said something else too. And I'm like, what is going on? Because he's not there. He had signed off, but it was still, somebody was still trying to communicate with me. And I figured it out that it was Bernard. It's just a whole bunch of stuff, but I just want to name some other things so people would know. Messages on license tags and billboards on the street, they speak to you if you pay attention. And I would smell his pipe. For a while there, he smoked a pipe that had like cherry scent. And that was when he really wanted to show off, I think. So we do that. And birds have always been messages for me. He will come every day. I'd see him out the kitchen window. It would always be a red-breasted robin. And I knew that was him. And when my nephew died just a few months ago, Cardinal came to the door. And instead of just landing on the railing of my deck, the Cardinal walked up to the door. I'm like, they don't usually do that. Had he had arms, he would have knocked on the door. And I just knew something was going on. What is happening? I said, who is that? Is that Bernard or is that my mother? And it said my mother in my head. And she was coming to let us know that he had drowned. And when we checked into it, the time that she came, that bird came, was the time they picked him out of the water. So it's stuff like that I pay attention to. Then one day I saw my mother, like Bob Vince used to say, I guess it's called plasma. It looks like smoke. It was her torso floating through the wall, through the air to the bathroom. And then when I got to my aunt's house down east, the same thing happened when I said something about her liking that rocking chair. And she just floated out there. And there was a eagle on her the corral where her horses were. And we went and talked to the eagle, but he wouldn't let us get too close to him. And then he flew on the other side where we couldn't do it. But I felt there was somebody in there too. There was another entity in there. And then the last thing was my brother, when he passed over. My mother was feeling really bad. That was her first child ever pass. And he said in my head, telepathy, so it works. He said, tell mother I'm in the turning of the fan, because she can see the paddles when they're stopped, but when they're turning fast, that's me. She can't see me, but I'm right here near her. And that stuck in my head for a long time. And then the very last thing was, I wasn't feeling so good at night, and I was asleep, but they woke me up somehow. And I heard 3 entities at my bedside. 2 of them were very tall, so I assumed they were angels because they were very light, very bright. And he was in the middle. They had brought him back. And they said to him, now you see she's okay. And they turned around just as I was waking up and went through my door, which was 3 of them side by side. It made me think those 3 Stooges, how they walk side by side. But anyway, they went through the door and they didn't have to crowd in. They just went. And they said, she's okay. Now you see she's okay. And it was so bright. I thought, wow, I woke up just in time to hear that. So there's lots of ways that we get communications from people. when I would go for a walk, there'd be not dimes, but nickels or pennies. And then one day I got a dime. And I'm like, what does the dime mean? I asked my son, he said, oh, he's trying to tell you that you're a dime, because that was what really hot girls were, dime, 10, number 10. And that's it. So far. But there's other things too. I just want to give people that you don't just have to look for the things that we've heard. Those are the things that you will probably see, but they come in all forms. Yeah.
Thank you, Lina. I did want to call attention to the chat. Mark found the name of the book, Saved by the Light by Daniel Brinkley.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Jim? Oh, I believe Ron has a question or statement. Ron, you're on mute.
There. Not a question. It's a applaud. Jim, you've done this work for so long, and your work is raising the vibration of love on this planet and human consciousness. Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Ron. I would say that we're all collaborating. I mean, tonight was a great example. I kind of started things off, but once the engine got turned on, everybody had something to add. You got your own stories, you have your own advice to help people. And think beyond just tonight. This is recorded. This is going to go out on YouTube. There are going to be people who will watch this. So you're all making contributions. We're all seeking higher vibration, and it's this collaborative effort that accelerates that energy level. So I want to thank everybody for being here. I want to thank everybody for your input. I don't think we have anything scheduled right away. Thursday nights, when we do our planning, I'm leaving for Togo, Africa on Friday. Little unique thing in my life. A friend of mine is being coronated as a tribal king over there. So there will be a videographer recording things. And when I get back from that trip to Togo, I anticipate having stories to tell. And reality in Togo is a little different than reality in the United States. So I hope to have some stories I can share with people. Keep an eye out for that. If you have ideas, there are things that people raised tonight that I think we ought to have further conversation on. The idea of lost souls, people don't make the transition. I think that we could have a program on that. The journey of souls, we have talked about that with Jen Caitlin at one time, but that may be worth having another conversation about how we plan our lives before we ever incarnate. So keep an eye out. It's great that you're here. This is a pretty good sized group, and thanks for your presence. Leslie, Daniel, or Mark, you have anything you'd like to share?
I just wanted to thank everyone. This has been a really wonderful conversation.
Okay, everybody, I guess that's it for this evening. I think Mark said that this tomorrow, if you have anybody or if you want to watch this recording, you'll be able to watch it tomorrow on our YouTube channel. Thank you for being here.